This is a bulldozer C-frame with some worn holes that need repairing. This hole had a hardened bush but is completely worn away. And this side still has this hardened bush that I need to remove. I'm going to start by grinding down the burrs on all 4 faces. Next, I need to remove the hardened bush that's still in the one ear. My first plan was to weld a couple runs on the inside of the bush to collapse it, then heat it out. The bush wasn't cooperating, so I used the torch and cut it. This plan worked. Let's quickly investigate how the hardened bush had worn. If you look at the wall thickness on this side of the bush, it's still thick and this side is almost worn away. This is because there's a constant pushing force in this direction from the blade when the dozer is working. On the opposite hole where it wore right through the bush, you can see most of the wear is just on the one side. You don't have to have a fancy line boring machine to repair these holes. Yes, it is nice to have, but I'm going to demonstrate with a couple things I slapped together in the workshop. I made these cones out of nylon in the lathe to align the boring bar. I'm going to use this bearing because I can tighten a grub screw on the boring bar when I pull the cones tight in position. The bearing comes from one of the square flanges I used to hold the boring bar when boring. Next I slide a shaft through these other holes on the C-frame and make sure my boring bar is running parallel with it. If my boring bar is parallel on 2 axes, I know it is positioned correctly. All was good, so I could mount the bearings. You can see I'm using easily sourced square flange bearings, flat bar I drilled and threaded rod I cut. Nothing fancy was needed here. Once the bearings were mounted, I could remove the lining cones. Next up, I needed to mount a bracket I made with material lying at the workshop. As mentioned before, I said you don't need a line boring machine. I'm going to use a magnetic base drill and clamp it onto my bracket. And that's all it is. It's now time to bore. If you're wondering why I'm taking a cut before I welded the hole up, it's because I would like to have my welding layer a little bit thicker than just welding in the hole and boring it out. So I just took 2 light cuts from both of the holes. The next step is quite important. I need to remove the drill, the boring bar, and the bearings from one of the ears so I can weld up one hole at a time. The reason I'm doing this is because the bearings on the other ears are still clamped in the correct position for the boring bar. So once I have completed the welding on this ear and I want to mount the bearings back on, I can slide the boring bar through the ear with the bearings that are still aligned, and that will help me align this side's bearings. It was now time to weld up the other ear. I just repeated the process I did before. I'm going to use the other side's bearings to align this side again. So once the welding was complete, I slid the boring bar through to mount the bearing and the bracket for the magnetic drill. And it was now time to bore the holes back to standard size. I must admit, the first few rough cuts were not easy. It's because the magnetic drill feeds with a rack and pinion gear, and it has a bit of backlash. But once the cutting tip started touching all round the surface of the hole, it cut smoothly. But in the end, it did the job and I was satisfied with the outcome. I now need to cut off my bracket and remove the bearings. Let's have a quick look at how the holes look before I finish up the job. I just need to grind out the welding that got in the grease groove and cut off the threaded rod. Here I use another workshop made tool to use a grinding disc on a drill to grind out the welding in the grease groove. Once that was done, I just cleaned up with the buffing disc. Both holes are now repaired and back to standard size. To finish off the job, I'm going to fit the new hardened bushings. I made a jig with a shoulder to assure my bush is seated in the correct depth when inserted. I heated the hole up till the diameter was larger than the bush. I then put romance on the bush and slid it in. Liquid nitrogen can be used to insert these bushings. But this video is proof that there's many ways to do a job. And that's the end. Thanks for watching, guys.